The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
My mother was, of course, still a Nazi lady. No? So when the American soldiers moved into our house, they asked my mother, "Are you a Nazi?" And my mother said, "Yes, I am Nazi." And then they said, "Oh, you are the first person we met who said she's a Nazi." So.
And she was proud.
Yes, of course she was proud. She was convinced that my father was right and did the right things. Never one word that she spoke bad about him. Then he came to live with us. I think it was 2 weeks or so. And she said to us smaller children, "That's an uncle from South America," or whatever. He had a little mustache. And he came up to see us when we were sleeping in our beds, I remember. And that is the only contact with my father I remember. He had good connections to the Vatican. He found refuge in some religious institution there, and he died very quick there.
My name's Philippe Sands. I'm Professor of Law at the University of London. The film is a slice of a book that I've been writing for the last 6 or 7 years. It's called East West Street, and it tells the story of my grandfather, who was born in 1904 in an obscure Ukrainian city called Lviv. I get an invitation a few years back to go and deliver a lecture about my work on mass killing. I deal with cases of crimes against humanity and genocide where hundreds of thousands are killed. And I accepted the invitation to find out about the city that he grew up in. In the context of that, I discovered what happened in 1942 in Lviv. A man called Hans Frank arrived and engaged in the implementation of what's come to be known as the final solution, killing of all the Jews in Lviv, amongst them my grandfather's entire family in that city. And I wanted to know more about Hans Frank. Who was he? He was a lawyer. I found a book written by his son, Nicholas. I read the book. It's an extraordinary book. I went to meet Nicholas in Hamburg. We became friends. And one day he said to me, "Philippe, they're not all like me, the children of senior Nazis. You need to meet my friend Horst." And we went off to visit Horst. And the story of the film is the story of the relationship between the three of us. The question of the attitude of new generations in countries that were involved, either Germany as perpetrators or countries which were occupied by the Nazis, differs. You know, we've just had the premiere of the film in Vienna at the Biennale, the Vienna Film Festival. There was so much interest that they scheduled a second Q&A that lasted 2.5 hours. In the course of that Q&A, I was asked about my feelings towards Germany. Nicholas is from Germany, and Austria. Horst is from Austria. And I said, it's a good question. I have different feelings towards Germany and Austria. When I'm in Germany now, I said, I feel completely relaxed, completely at home. I grew up in a household in which we were not allowed to have German items. There was no German fridge, there was no German car. 50 years on, I'm completely comfortable with Germany because I have a strong sense Germany has really engaged. And then I told the audience in Vienna, I don't feel like that about Austria, and I don't feel like that about Vienna. There's a level of discomfort that I have. And that prompted a really strong reaction. And coming straight to your question, how do people react? The older people in that audience generally turned on me and said, it's not true. We've engaged with our responsibility of our country. We've built monuments, we've built statues, blah, blah, blah. And then the younger people in the audience started speaking and saying, it's not true. There's a conspiracy of silence. There's darkness about the whole issue. People don't want to talk about it. People don't want to engage in it. And so I think there's a a different engagement, obviously for each individual where they come from, but I think members of the informed younger generation recognise that particularly in Austria there's been an unwillingness to engage fully with what happened. What's going on in Europe now? It's a difficult time. The economies are not in good shape apart from Germany. There is a tremendous influx of refugees from what's gone wrong in Iraq and in Syria and in Libya, and that is contributing to a reigniting of the kinds of instincts that I think led to a very bad place 70 years ago. You will have seen in the film, we end up on our road trip in a field in Ukraine with a bunch of people burying German and Ukrainian war dead, and a lot of them are dressed in Waffen-SS uniforms, and they're joyful about it as though that is a normal thing to be doing. A lot of people found that very shocking in the film. I found it very shocking to find myself at the heart of Europe in the company of such people. So there's a constant reminder that we have to be extremely alert to what went on and what is going on now. In this film, you find me in a dual situation. I'm faced with two older men. They're both in their mid-70s. One, Nicholas, thinks his father was a criminal who deserved to be hanged, as he was, at Nuremberg. The other, Horst, whose father was the deputy of Nicholas's father, thinks that his dad was basically a great guy. He looked after the Ukrainians. Sure, a few Jews died, but actually that was, in the scheme of things, not the defining issue for him. As the film goes on, you see that my engagement with that changes. At the beginning of the film, I'm playing a mediating role. I'm equidistant from the two men. I'm trying not to take sides. I'm trying to be a facilitator of a conversation. We then go to the Ukraine, and I find myself in the city of Lviv, confronted with Horst's unwillingness to recognise what his father did. And as we say in London, I lost my rag. I got pretty upset with Horst. And at that point, the mask of the lawyer slips, and it's replaced with the mask of the human being. What you're taught as a litigating attorney is never lose your cool. So it's a scene that I'm not particularly comfortable with because I lose my cool. But I lose my cool because I've been taken into a place in which I'm engaging with my deepest and strongest emotions in relation to the well-being of my own family, and the sense that the person that I'm with is not recognizing what happened to my family. And so I lose my temper. I regret that I lose my temper, but I understand why I lose my temper. And thereafter, I am pushing Horst, not for an apology, not for an acceptance of responsibility, but for an acknowledgement of what his father did, and that never comes. Can Horst ever acknowledge what his father really did? No, I don't think that he can. I think for him to do so would lead him into a space in which the essential foundations of his existence and of his being would collapse. He has constructed for himself, as a coping mechanism, the belief that his father did good, more good than bad, and he's in denial about the facts. And the reason that he does that, I think, is one that I sort of understand. There's a moment in the film very early on where Horst is reflecting. It's a one-on-one interview, and Horst is remembering his 6th birthday in 1945. And at that point he starts weeping on camera. It's the only point he ever breaks down in that way. And what he's recognizing is that at that moment, as a 6-year-old, his world had collapsed. Normality was gone, he said. And I think Horst's struggle is to recreate a sense of normality. And to hold on to the possibility that his dad was a decent guy is about maintaining the illusion that he comes from a normal, regular family. His father was indicted for mass murder in 1945 and 1946 by the Americans and by the Polish government. He went into hiding, first in the mountains around Austria, and he then took refuge protected by the Vatican. And he died in the Vatican in the summer of 1949. He was never tried and he was never convicted, and that fact allows Horst to take refuge in a space in which he can proclaim the innocence of his father. What's my feeling towards the Vatican? I'd like to know a lot more about the Vatican. Horst has opened up with me very considerably. Any document I ask to see, he allows me to see. He's shown me the letters that passed between his mother and father while he was in the Vatican. I've got his mother's diaries in relation to that period. And it's plain that he was protected by the Vatican, and that raises, I think, the most fundamental questions about what happened. And there's never been a full accounting of the role of the Vatican. You need to understand that Otto von Wächter was part of that cell that is known as the Rat Run, with Mengele and with Eichmann, that led from the Vatican to Argentina. There is a big story still to be told about what exactly happened there. His wife, Otto von Wächter's wife, thinks that he was murdered, and I think that that is probably right, and that he may well have been murdered in relation to what he knew and didn't know about the rat run from the Vatican to Argentina. What is to be done about getting access to the material held by the Vatican? Very little. The Vatican is like a sovereign state. It is entitled to a sort of immunity. It cannot be forced to give things up. But I've got to say, there's much to be said in favour of elements of real decency from Horst. I said to him one day, look, Horst, you're sitting on all this extraordinary material, including the correspondence between your mother and your father in that period when he was in the Vatican. Why don't you give everything to the Holocaust Museum in Washington so that scholars and members of the public can have access to that material and can review it with a view to finding out exactly what happened? And he's done it. And the Holocaust Museum went to his Schloss, his castle, and spent a week there digitizing absolutely every document. And I suspect that in that material we will find some answers, but not all, to the many, many, many questions about the circumstances in which he was being protected by the Istituto Teutonico in the Vatican.
My father always wanted to please Hitler. So he gave a about the fate of the Jews or about the fate of the Polish people. Yeah, here it is. For me, it was the most special room in whole Wawel because it was a bath I've never seen before or afterwards. It was one of my dreams to have a bath like this, going down 2 steps. But this was the only gentle experience I had with my father. I came in through this door, very small, and my father was standing here shaving, and he saw me and gave a little bit of his shaving foam to my nose. And that was the only gentle moment between him and me which I remember. And you can see that I remember how much I was longing for the love of my father. Otherwise, it's quite a normal procedure. But it burned into my soul. That was the only gentle moment.
Well, in relation to this film and the book, I've spent particularly long amounts of time with Ukrainians and Poles, so I've got to limit myself to that. In relation to Ukraine, I'm bound to say you have terrible scenes in the film of me hanging out with people in Waffen-SS uniforms. You need to know, and your viewers need to know, that is not the dominant view and it is not the majority view in the Ukraine. The people that I was accompanied with, Ukrainian friends of mine, were as appalled and horrified as I was by what they were seeing. It is a minority. Nevertheless, it's a very public and vocal minority, and as we know in life, public and vocal minorities can grow. And the unwillingness of the Ukrainian authorities to stamp out this kind of celebration of that aspect of the past, I think, is potentially very problematic. In relation to Poland, I can tell you this anecdote. There's a scene in the film where Nicholas Frank and I go back to Poland together. We go to the Wawel Castle in Krakow, and we go and see a painting, very famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci called Cecilia Gallerani, the portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, Lady with an Ermine, which he has not seen for 70 years. His father stole that painting in 1939 and kept it in the family home in the Wawel Castle, and as a little boy he would stand in front of it. 70 years later, he sees that painting again. We had to go through a tremendous negotiation with the owners of the painting to be able to film him revisiting the painting. And in the contract was included a clause that before the film was released, the owners of the painting wanted to see the entirety of the film to make sure that we showed Poland in a decent light in the film. In other words, the film was not used in any way. That raises very fundamental questions, because on the one hand we wanted to show the painting, on the other hand we wanted to retain control of the substance. And when the film was finished, we ended up sending it. And indeed, they were actually very decent about the whole thing. There were a couple of points where they said, just be a little bit careful with language here. As you know, President Obama got into some difficulty when he referred to concentration camps in Poland. The correct formulation is concentration camps in Nazi-controlled Poland, or on the territory of Poland controlled by the Nazis. There is an incredible sensitivity to these kinds of points of detail, and I've become acutely sensitized to these issues. It is a minefield. If you do something that makes someone on one side of the issue happy, you're going to make someone on the other side of the issue unhappy. So you're constantly walking a thin line, avoiding creating offence, and in a sense being politically correct in a way that I'm not particularly comfortable with. But nevertheless, to get a film like this made, you've got to tread those difficult paths. Let's talk about the question of Jews in Europe right now. I'm half French. I have Jewish family in France. They're still there, and they intend fully to stay. There are things they are anxious about, but they're not going anywhere. And the number of people who have left France, say for Israel, is actually very, very small, and it is not increasing. And it's extremely problematic for the hundreds of thousands who remain to have people saying all over the world, they're all leaving, when it's not happening. It's terribly undermining of them. Imagine you happen to be Jewish in France, and people in various parts of the world are saying, oh, they're all leaving because it's so terrible. What happens? That has the effect for others in the community, non-Jews, of feeling that they are being criticized for what they're doing to Jews. And it makes the situation even more complex for the hundreds of thousands who remain. I can tell you my own situation in England, as someone who's Jewish in England. I have not faced the slightest problem ever. I have a life at the university. I'm a practicing barrister, one of those guys who wears a wig. Have I ever experienced a limitation on my professional or personal path because I happen to be Jewish? Absolutely not. And I'm going to go even further. It's a really curious thing. I act for governments around the world. Okay? I'm an international lawyer. I only do work for governments. I get retained a lot and get appointed, for example, as arbitrator, by Arab governments. They all know I'm Jewish. They have absolutely no problem with it. And some of the myths that emerge in terms of the engagement with these kinds of issues are that. They are myths. The realities are often different. Now, that is not to say there are not the most serious problems to worry about. So going on the other side of the story, I give a lecture in the Ukraine on my own family situation, and young students will come up to me and will say to me very cryptically, Professor Sands, your story means a lot to me personally. I know what they're saying. They're saying to me, I'm Jewish, or I'm part Jewish, but I don't want to talk about it openly in this place. So I'm not starry-eyed about the risks that are there, but equally I'm concerned about stirring things up beyond the reality of what the situation is. My position on academic boycotts is I'm against all academic boycotts. I believe passionately in freedom of expression, and so I accept invitations to go to places that will probably make you blanch. I've gone and given lectures in Iran at the University of Tehran, and no one controls what I say. When I arrive, I say what I want to say. If I believe, as I do, that more torture happens in Iran than in any other country in the world right now, I say that, and I say that when I'm in Tehran. You start boycotting people like me and others from going to other places, and you stop that flow of ideas and people coming. I went and gave a lecture 2-3 years ago at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I wanted to go and give the same lecture at Birzeit University because I wanted to speak to Palestinian students. I wanted them to hear what my views were on certain things. They invited me, and then they said, oh, well, if you go to the Hebrew University, we have a boycott for people who speak at the Hebrew University, and it's more difficult for you to, in fact, you can't come. And I said, well, I'm going to come. I'm against boycotts of any sort for academics, and they found a way to let me come and talk. And so my personal position, and it's across the board, is to be against boycotts of the academic nature of that kind. But I go even further. I mean, I said to you at the beginning, I'm married to an American. I am a powerful believer in freedom of expression. I'm very uncomfortable, even with Holocaust denial prohibitions, because I think all that does is just push things under the carpet. And if people are going to be going around denying things like the Holocaust, I want them to be doing it publicly so we can know who's doing it and so we can confront the ideas. The ideas don't go away when you ban that kind of expression. They go underground, and those ideas get expressed, and there's irritation that they can't talk about it openly, and things ferment and become even worse. So I put the issue of academic boycotts into a special category. I would have gone to apartheid South Africa to universities and talked. I think academic freedom of expression is absolutely vital. What journey have I taken in making this film? That is a very big question. I grew up in a household in which what happened before 1945 was not talked about. My grandfather, I now realize, I knew terrible things had happened. I didn't know the scale of what had happened. I now know the scale of what had happened. I feel even closer to him. He was very close to him. He lived until 1997. He came to my wedding in New York in 1993. He flew here as a 90-year-old from Paris. He loved Paris. And I feel a closeness to him and the community that he came from and the community that is lost now that I had not previously been aware of. There's a scene in the film where I explain my concern about feelings of tribalism, that I take refuge as a lawyer in the kinds of cases that I've done in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, in the Congo, in the kinds of places where dreadful things have happened. And I see what happens when nationalism and ethnic strife and tribalism essentially goes crazy. So tribalism makes me very, very anxious. But what I've learned in this project is I too am capable of being tribal, and that my own relationship with my grandfather is tribal. I've learnt that, and I've understood in this process the complexities of tribalism and the dangers of where tribalism leads to, but a recognition also that it's inherent in all of us to feel tribalism. There's a moment in the film, Nicholas Frank has given us access to the home movies of his father. It's remarkable footage. There is a scene, and what's even more remarkable about the footage is it's in colour, it's not in black and white. And there's a scene in that footage of a girl in a red dress, just like the girl in Spielberg's film Schindler's List. And I see that girl, and I feel a connection with that girl, which I would not have felt in the same way when I would have seen Schindler's List. And so I both embrace that sense of connection, but I'm wary of what it leads to. So one of the issues that comes up when you're dealing with someone like Horst and the unwillingness to recognize the role that his father played in the events between 1939 and 1944 in Austria and in the territory of what is now known as the Ukraine, is a sense of being taken into a place that begins to look perilously like denial of the facts. So the space that Horst has created is he's not a Holocaust denier. He knows that millions of Jews and Poles were killed on the territory that his father was responsible for. He doesn't deny that for a single moment. What does he say about his father? he says, well, he didn't shoot anyone personally. That argument can soon be swatted away. Then he says, it was all the SS that did it. Well, that is inaccurate. We know, as Nicholas Frank makes clear in the film, the SS were absolutely in cahoots with the civilian administration. The civilian administration of his father, for example, ran transport systems to basically ship people to places of extermination. And then he says, well, there's a scene in the synagogue where he says, well, what could he do? It's going to happen anyway. He might as well stay and try and do some good. And it's at that point that I really lose my cool. I find a letter given to me by the office of Eli Rosenbaum in the US Department of Justice, the last Nazi hunter in the DOJ. A letter dated the 25th of August 1991. The letter is written personally by Heinrich Himmler to Mr. Stuckart, the Minister of Interior in Berlin. And the letter says, I've been to Lemberg to see Wächter. And I've asked him whether he wants to go back to Vienna, essentially to do a desk job and be off the front line of implementing the final solution. Wächter tells me he does not wish to go home. He wishes to stay, and indeed he did stay right until the summer of 1944 when the Red Army took over that territory. That is, for me now, speaking as a lawyer, dispositive evidence of a desire to stay and exterminate. He did not face death. He could have gone back to some dull desk job in Vienna. He chose to stay. The letter is devastating. Horst can't recognize that. That's not denial of the Holocaust. It's denial of the autonomy and responsibility of his own father in being engaged in the Holocaust. And the two things are different. And it's driven, for very complex psychological reasons, of the desire to preserve the illusion and the image that his father was a decent man. And I understand, as a son myself, and as a father myself, that desire. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of the gravest disappointment and concern that he can't recognize and acknowledge what his father has done. And that failure becomes, I think, in effect, a sort of apology for the actions of his father. And it's a very thin line between apology and acceptance, between acceptance and complicity, and between complicity and responsibility. And that continuum is a very, very complex continuum. And it's not particular or peculiar to the Nazi situation. It's a universal theme. And this film addresses a theme that touches all of us, because all of us are bound to ask the question, what if our dad had done something that was equivalent? How would we react? And putting our hands on our hearts, we cannot know how we would react. These two men offer two extreme positions. Where in the spectrum between the two would we be? I don't know. I hope I'd be in the right place. I hope I'd be in the Nicholas place, although maybe not to such an extreme. But the Horst place is problematic, because the Horst place makes it more likely that these things will happen again.
Life was something for us you can't imagine today. Death was so near to everybody.
Our fathers both were heavily involved. Heavily. Our father committed the most horrible crimes.
My family is very directly affected by the actions of these men. The killing of my grandfather's entire family.
I was raised like a young Nazi boy, and that was normality.
He loved Hitler more than his family. When I saw the first pictures in the newspapers, mountains of corpses, children my age, that really hurts.
The question of the historical responsibility of my father is a very complex one. He was a complete optimist. He believed that Hitler would change his politics.
I have peace with my father because I acknowledged his crimes. He is not accepting his father was mass murder.
Your father was sitting there announcing that 100,000 Jews are going to be murdered, and your father
That's what your father did.
Yes.
That's a father to love?
How can we hide? Accept it, dear friend.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum, and welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And we are joined this evening by two very special guests. First, the film's director, David Evans. And this is the writer of the film and the interlocutor of the film, and in many ways the soul of the film, and in many ways a colleague of mine, Philippe Sands. David is a professional filmmaker. Philippe is really an internationally recognized human rights lawyer. So it was fun and interesting to watch you in a very different setting. Although you did have the wig on for a short time.
I didn't want to have the wig on.
David insisted.
It's David's film.
He insisted.
David wanted that bit in.
Remind you who this guy really is. The film's perspective is fascinating in many ways, and we're going to get to some of the ideas of the fact that you wrote it, and yet there's the objective obligations of the film, and yet there's the personal imperatives of the film. But the film really, I think, is raising a question about the distinctions between legal guilt and moral responsibility, in a way. Because in the film, you say to Horst at the grave site, you say, look, this has nothing to do with you, right? This is really about, you say, I think your line is, it's not your moral responsibility, it's your father's moral responsibility. I think you said, but I'm not sure that that's what the film is really saying, because in a way, and I want you to know, I'm sympathetic to this. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times many years ago about this idea that all Germans should feel morally responsible, that there's a distinction between legal guilt, where one, goes to jail and there's a judgment under the rule of law. And then there's this broader understanding. There's a moral responsibility that these were crimes committed on the soil of Germany, and that in this case, of course, were the children of Nazis, but that would be true of the grandchildren of Nazis, or the cousins of Nazis, or the next-door neighbors of Nazis, that moral responsibility is something we shouldn't run away from. We should recognize that it's something different in character and degree from actual legal punishment, but it's something we should embrace, because it seems like the film is asking Horst to embrace it.
No.
Okay.
I do not believe that Horst or Nicholas have a moral responsibility for what their fathers did. I believe, and what I wanted from Horst and what I did not get, was an acknowledgement of the facts of what his father had been engaged in, which is a different thing. And I think that Horst, by failing to give me that acknowledgement, enters a space into which it might be said, and I think can be said, that he is an apologist for the actions of his father. And by becoming an apologist for the actions of his father, he risks crossing a line into acceptance of what his father did and into complicity with what his father did. And I think those are fine and complex and difficult lines to draw. I don't think in any way he has a responsibility for what his father did. I think he has a responsibility to himself to deal fairly with the facts.
Why? Why does he have this obligation? Must truth trump familial loyalty?
No.
He has a loyalty to his father. Why?
I think you see for yourself in that film why this matters. I think many of you in this room will have been appalled by the scenes shot outside Brody, as I was appalled to find myself in a field with people wearing Waffen-SS uniforms, in which dear Horst can go around shaking hands, can say it's terrific being here.
Well, he said it's his best day. He actually said,
Yeah,
people said nice things about my father.
Right.
It was a really great day.
and he looks happy and he looks relaxed, and that's problematic. And more than that, there's the moment where he's thinking about getting into the car.
Yeah.
And I'm standing there near David. You must come in now, David, thinking, oh, horse, please do not get into that car. Do not sit like your dad in the back of that car. And of course, he does it.
Philippe loves making the distinction between the two of us, that he knows I'm behind the camera going, get in the car, because it's
I think that Horst's failure to acknowledge takes him into a space in which he is effectively accepting what his father did. And I think that's a problem. And I think for a son to describe himself as son of the governor is definitely problematic, because by doing that, he is effectively ratifying not only this guy is my father, but he's effectively saying, he was the governor and I'm the son of the governor.
Right, we're still owning the original titles, right?
He didn't need to say that.
But Philippe, in the film you say at some point, and again, I'm interested in this what you would describe as his obligation to at least confront the truth, rather than what I'm raising is, well, maybe it's just a broader moral responsibility to begin with. But you say in the film, I cannot accept that his expressions of his father's good character and actions. And then you say something that almost seems, from my perspective, the film at that point says, well, this film really has a point of view, right? Because you then say, I hear him justifying the killing of my family, right? The fact that he simply will not condemn his father.
Not condemn.
Acknowledge.
No, these distinctions are very, very important. I have never wanted Horst to condemn.
So he doesn't have to do what Nicholas does.
Well, to the contrary, I don't want him to do what Nicholas does. I'm very uncomfortable with what Nicholas does. I don't need Nicholas apologising to me up the wazoo for what his father did to my grandfather's family. Nicholas has acknowledged what has happened. I think he takes it, I speak personally, it's for him to deal with it as he deals with it, but I think he takes things to an extreme that makes a lot of people feel very uncomfortable, because it was still his father. And so I'm not looking for condemnation, I'm not looking for acceptance of guilt, I'm looking for an acknowledgement of the facts. And there's that moment in the aula where I show him the indictment, and there's that wonderful shot on his face, and you're thinking as you're watching it, right, how's he going to get out of this one? It's absolutely a slam dunk. There is no way out of it, and he finds a way out of it.
It sounds like what a lawyer would say, because you do, in many ways, serve that role here. There is a judgment here to some degree, and I wonder. I look at Horst and I think, here's what I see. I see a very limited man in every possible way, almost childlike, obtuse to everything, focused on buildings and things that not about people. He literally, the film starts with the idea that, my world came to an end when I was 6, right? I mean, this idea that they were trapped in this childhood. He had a real relationship with his father. Nicholas did not. He obviously loved his father. And isn't it not enough? I guess the answer is no, but isn't it not enough to say, he's not defending his father. He's not saying he's a Nazi. He's not saying Nazis are right. He's not saying the Jews deserved what they got. He's just simply not taking in what you would say are the facts. He's refusing to take in. People do this all the time, Philippe. People don't take in information. It's given to them, but there's all sorts of reasons for filtering things out. Fear, love, loyalty. People are in bad marriages. They don't take in the information, right? They just don't want to talk about the drinking problem. This, to me, seems very human, especially for a guy who we're acknowledging from the beginning. This is a very limited man. And it just seems to me that it's weighted for something as if we're waiting for him to acknowledge. And I think, why do we care? Why are we better off? Why was this so important to you?
Well, I think I've explained that. I mean, I don't actually think Horst is a limited man. I think he's a very complex man. I mean, you must come in, David. And
yes, David.
And I think he's a very damaged person. You rightly take it back to that moment when he was a 6-year-old. He's been through a tremendous trauma. He's paid a huge price for talking to me.
Oh, is that true? How explain that to the audience?
In terms of his relationship with his own family, who would rather the name of the Wächter family stay covered in darkness and not be known more broadly. He has gone out of his way at my instigation to make all of the materials that he holds in his considerable family archive, his parents' letters, his mother's diaries...
Available to you?
Available to everyone. He's given them to the Holocaust Museum in Washington at my instigation. So he is not a limited person. He's a complex person who is struggling to come to terms in his own way with a trauma that he went through as a child. And I don't like some of the things that he says, but I think he's trying in his own way to come to terms and cope with something that is beyond our comprehension. I mean, it's very easy for us sitting in London and New York these days to, imagine, well, not imagine, to pass judgment perhaps, but how would we feel if our fathers had killed 500,000 people? I mean, would we continue to honour our father? Would we continue to love our father? That's what this film is really about. How do you deal with the reality of that kind of situation?
David?
From my perspective, the drift of your questioning makes me somewhat uneasy because it's querying Philippe's persistent pressurizing of Horst to do what? Seems to be the kind of subtext of what you're saying. What is it that Philippe's expecting of Horst, really?
Yeah.
And that makes me feel uneasy because that impression that Philippe gives is down to the way that I've manipulated the images. It's not true that Philippe is obsessively badgering Horst for some admission of guilt.
Well, Nicholas is.
Yes, kind of, but like I said, really, I'm confessing that what you're making an observation about is the process of filmmaking in the cutting room, and really, the reason that I underwent that process is because it's simply a morally barren question. If the premise of the film were, here are two men whose fathers were both senior Nazis, one thinks his father was a good man, one thinks his father was a bad man, which one is right? That's not a film. It's not interesting to any of you for 5 minutes. We all know who's right and who's wrong. What's interesting is the way an empathetic relationship with those men, in this case Horst, makes one question or interrogate the processes by which our ideas of justice are confused by love, and our memory of past events are inflected by the relationships we have with the people who perpetrated them. So for me, it's very, very useful that Philippe does not stay in the relatively safe and powerful, invulnerable position of the omniscient narrator who, it might be said, would be telling you, the audience, how to react to these other two men, but much more interesting that by virtue of his own personal connection to the history that connects the three of them, he surrenders that impartial position and becomes a protagonist along with the other two, because he has an emotional agenda as well, just as Horst has an emotional agenda. Well, it's for me, that's the film I wanted to make, but I hate it. I hate it when I feel like Philippe is being somehow, not that I'm saying that you're doing this personally, but I don't like the idea that Philippe, I know that it's true that Philippe is being put in a more vulnerable position than he necessarily needed to have allowed himself to be placed in.
Well, but I'm a fairly robust individual, so I think I can...
Yes, he's sturdy and healthy. But it's really a story of three sons. I mean, clearly, it's a story, and that's...
Two sons and a grandson.
Two sons and a grandson.
But it didn't need to be, there's my point. We could have made this a much, to my mind, of course, much less interesting film.
No, I agree. This is what makes it interesting, is that the writer of the film is also in the film.
Yeah.
He's a character.
In fact, it's very, very hard. It's very hard to actually give Philippe the correct credit
I thought the same thing.
Because although, I mean, literally the correct screen credit, because although in the end we elected to say writer, we toyed with writer and presenter, but to say presenter, that actually minimizes the very thing that I'm trying to promote, which is the fact that he's actually in there with them. But he's much more than just a participant on the level of Horst and Nicholas. It was tricky.
It's very
every single thing that you hear Philippe saying in voiceover is something that he either wrote as commentary or said, but quite a portion of it, including the section that you were just referring to, and Philippe is reacting angrily to it. That was originally something that he said in the moment. It wasn't something that
he didn't script that.
He didn't script it to begin with, but of course in the process of needing to re-record it because the sound quality was terrible or it didn't fit the bit that precedes or succeeds or whatever, he obviously has given his tacit approval to repeating the thing that he originally said, as it were, in the heat of the moment. So, you know, there's just there's not quite a category, there's not quite a description that explains exactly what Philippe did in that.
It's an incredibly intriguing film for many levels, but one of which is because of Philippe, because he's in it. He's the storyteller, but yet he's a very important participant. And it is his job, he says here, he says, well, I'm really uncomfortable with Nicholas and the way he responded to me. But in many ways, the film is about two sons of Nazis responding to a grandson of Jewish victims, right?
That's absolutely right. And I mean, to be honest, that wasn't remotely what we thought we were doing. Yeah. But to me, it's continually revelatory. I'm a director of drama mostly, so I'm used to telling actors where to go and how to stand and what angle to the camera they should be at, and whether this registers or not. Half of the time I'm sure it doesn't, but there's meant to be some sort of subtextual way in which that's adding to your reading of the script. That's what drama directors do. And in this film, this documentary film, where I absolutely didn't try and place any kind of measure of control over what they did, there are some scenes, like the scene by the mass grave, for example, where the literal physical body language of the three men towards each other is so eloquent. Yes. And it is literally that there's these three men who are almost physically drawn together by this shared trauma.
Gentlemen, you've made a very intriguing film. Thank you.